to Season 10, Episode 12 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
Of course, reading the Thomas Sowell Reader, reading some of the best articles from the economist Thomas Sowell, this time on the second episode of our discussion of his articles on ethnicity and race, going over some topics of very similar topics to what we were talking about last time, actually, with a lot of the affirmative action, sort of government influence in matters of race and stuff like that. But with a really interesting article, I think at the end, the last one we'll talk about how he kind of examines and compares the lives of Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. I thought that one was really interesting. But
W.D. Du Bois?
Du Bois? I don't know. French name, but yeah, Du Bois.
Well, I'm from St. Louis. We pronounce all the French names wrong.
It's very
Shodo and well, that might be closer to than some of them. Mm-hmm. Anyway, yeah, St. Louis is notorious for purposely mispronouncing St. Louis or French-derived terminology.
Speaking of St. Louis, you went to Mom's, didn't you?
I did.
What shop in St. Louis that's closing?
Yeah, I don't know if they're going to reopen somewhere else, but it was a dreary February day, and we got there about 11:30, and there was a line out the door, and like halfway down the block, like where that stop sign is.
Wow.
And then when we left, it was like almost to the stop sign, and so we waited an hour to get a sandwich. Not sure that was such a brilliant idea, but for tradition's sake, it's been there for I think 47 years as a little deli sandwich shop. That was like an old school, like Italian neighborhood, neighborhood deli and sandwich shop when it first opened up. And, I don't know the whole history of it, but I think they might have lived upstairs, like the traditional thing. And anyway, they lost their lease, but sandwiches are still good.
Yeah. Best sandwiches I've ever had, that's for sure.
Best cold sandwiches, for sure. I mean, it's like, of course, I've only had one sandwich there.
I went there. You haven't had any of their hot sandwiches.
That's correct. Well, I went there when I was a young prosecuting attorney. Never heard of the thing, but the guys from St. Louis knew about it. And they said, let's go down to Mom's for lunch. I'm like, all right, I'll go with you. And it's kind of a drive from Clayton, where we worked, to South St. Louis. And it was worth it, though. And they just had outdoor seating and picnic tables up front. And I got a Charlie special. And at that point, I had never had mayo on a sandwich.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought mayo was gross.
I think I had the same experience, too. I think the first time I ever had mayo on a sandwich was Charlie sub. I think that's
like 20 years later. Yeah, you weren't even born yet when I went there the first time. And so, yeah, I passed on that tradition. And it's really convenient because it's like maybe a mile or two away from the Record Exchange, and which is a phenomenal vinyl record shop. If anybody is visiting St. Louis and has any interest in vinyl and going into a place that will give you anxiety from all the stacks and stacks of vinyl, old stereo equipment, used VCRs and DVDs stacked almost to the ceiling. It's an old library building, St. Louis Public Library building, and it just has, I think it might be the largest collection of vinyl records in the nation. Certainly.
They claim, actually. Yeah. It's like on their website that they say it's the largest record. I mean, it's just walls and walls of stuff.
Yeah, it's all used records. So, and then the upstairs has singles, which I'm not into. I probably should get some singles because, like, singles are kind of neat, especially if an auto stereo where it'll drop them. That way, you don't have to listen to the whole album, but I'm into listening to all the lesser known tracks. Mm-hmm. I've decided I'm going to go through my entire collection alphabetically.
Wow.
But I'm only listening to one or the other side of each album. And my thought is, I feel like I've hit a maximum amount I have over 600 albums. And I feel like I don't listen to a lot of them at all.
Yeah.
And so if I am unwilling to continue the streak with any album, then I'm going to have to turn it in for store credit or something at one of these shops. But I've been going at it a couple days. I mean, I was only a couple hours at a time, but I'm still an A. It's going to be a while.
I would have the same problem, too, if I tried to do that.
This is going to be a year-long project, so I can give updates weekly to see which letter of the alphabet I'm on in case anybody was interested.
Yeah, we could start talking about the chapter here in a second, but yeah, I'd have an even worse problem because I have over 1,000 at this point. Well, the big problem with me is because I haven't had any of them in one place for. Well, I mean, I guess over the summer they were all in one place, but most of them kind of just packed away in storage. And so I've never had like my eyes on my full collection for like 4 years or so at this point. And so it's very easy for me to be like, well, I have room in my apartment right now for a couple more records, neglecting the hundreds that I have sitting in the basement at home. So I'm like,
my house. That's right.
It's like, what's the harm in picking up a $5 record right now? Because, it's good music. But yeah, no, I have way too many records.
I just paid a pretty penny for a used vinyl that I usually don't pay much for. I usually I'm a bargain hunter.
Yeah.
I paid $35 for a Rush album. Rush is really hard to find.
Really?
Used. They have reissue ones every once in a while, but if you're really hunting for which I'm not like a collector of these. Like some people collect them and keep them in sealed containers. I want the ones that lived somewhere for a while, breathed, played music for somebody that really enjoyed it back in the day, and then they died, and then their family didn't know what to do with it, so they sold it for a pittance to some shop like Record Exchange. He had like we went in there Saturday. He had, I don't know if it was thousands of CDs and boxes, because they have like this CD section, and now that's in like the lobby. The CDs are. It seems like somebody must have just he must have got a hold of a collection from somebody, because they're bringing them in, trying to sort through them, and they're stacked up all over that little counter area where he sells. It's like he's walled in. They had done a really good job of like sorting stuff out and kind of thinning it out and organizing.
I know over the past couple of years they've definitely thinned out, because I remember when I first started going there, it felt like a hazard to walk into some of this stuff, because stuff was just so high. Like, I really hope the earthquake doesn't hit right now.
And I think it was rainy all. Yeah, it was rainy all week, so they had. I think there's like 4 different spots that they have buckets and pails, trash cans or whatever, collecting the rain. And it's a tall ceiling. For people who haven't been there, it's like an old library building, so the ceiling is like, what do you think, 30 feet up?
Oh, for sure,
at least. And so it's got smaller sections of what would be the display cases that are empty and covered in plastic, because the water is dripping down. And you'd think eventually he would repair the roof. But I mean, I'm sure it's an expense, but you'd think they'd be able to at least patch it. It was some tar or something. I don't know.
Up there.
A flat roof. You'd think I don't know.
All right, well, let's talk about the book we're supposed to be talking about. Start with this first article titled "Recycled" and then in quotes "racism," and this one's just saying essentially how these sort of hoaxes just keep getting repeated by the media every few years or so. And he's especially pointing out, and he says this headline: the September 14th, 2005 issue of the New York Times says blacks hit hardest by costlier mortgages. 13 years earlier, virtually the identical story appeared in the Wall Street Journal under the title "Federal Reserve Details Pervasive Racial Gap in Mortgage Lending." So he says basically these articles are trying to argue that they say the exact same argument, that it's just this race factor that's impacting, and these banks must be racist because they see a somewhat similarly situated black person and they do not give him the same access to loans. But then he says, well, if you actually look at the data, they're not really similarly situated, right? You have this just more common to have other issues with credit and things like that. So that's really what's explaining this gap. Isn't just the race factor; it's the just credit history of these people, which generally is worse among the black population. That's the argument he's making here.
Yeah, and this is something that's kind of been an unspoken theme of my comments about a lot of the podcast episodes, where we'll bring up a topic, especially like with his writing, because it's timely of the time, and then it's like there's these hoaxes are still going on to this day. And I think the money quote from this article is, he says, however, both research and old age tend to produce skepticism about things that look plausible on the surface. Just scratching the surface a little often makes a plausible case collapse like a house of cards. And so what we're seeing in real time, that's so true about these. My rule of thumb is anytime there's on a college campus, there's a racist incident like with a swastika or nooses hanging up, it is always a person of color and a left-wing person doing it every single time. And that's been true for 10 years. Plus,
or it's completely innocuous. Like, I don't know if I've told this story on the podcast, but I'm sure I've told you at Truman once. I think it was my freshman year, actually. I think it was like my welcome to campus, really, because it was right at the beginning of the semester. Maybe it was my second year. I think it was the first, but we got this mass email sent out by like the Department of Public Safety. So this are the police officers on campus from the chief of police at Truman's campus saying, we recognize anyone impacted by, this incident that occurred, early in the semester before people arrived on campus. And anyone who was impacted, go see counseling services because there was a noose hung up in the art lab, is what they said. There's this noose and that's what the email kind of portrayed it as. But then reading the email a little closer, a couple paragraphs down, the revelation was actually that was just an extension cord that, comes down from the ceiling. And the way to store those without them dragging on the ground is to just tie them up. That's what this was. It evidently was reported, and a bunch of people were really upset by this. And so the email from the chief of police was, we encourage anyone to seek the help of the university counseling services if you were negatively impacted by it. And it's like, it was an extension cord hung up so it wouldn't be dragging on the ground. But it's stuff like that. It's these weird hoaxes or these weird things that people just completely overreact to.
And I think it was like, I thought you said it was in a theater group or something. I thought you forwarded that to me. So like you'd have speakers or musical instruments or something like that be plugged in. And so they'd have to be available like in the middle of the room, depending on what the set was or whatever. Or maybe it was artwork.
I think it was an art lab because it was one of the pottery lab or something.
So they may need to have an equipment there to help them with the pottery wheel or whatever. Yeah, and it's like anybody who knows anything about electrical work or whatever would recognize that's a power cord that you want to have access to, not against the wall. So you don't run it along the floor because it's a tripping hazard. So you tie it up about 7 feet off the ground, and it's not a noose. It's just like you're just shortening the cord and keeping it bound up above the head level so people don't bump their heads into it. And so that supports, so somebody must have reported, oh my God, there's a noose. No, there's not a noose, for crying out loud. And so we're seeing this in real time this week. In fact, I went on Facebook today for like the first time forever. And when my sisters posted forwarded this story of some guy that worked at the National Park Service who'd gotten fired by Trump, and it was his live stream. And I am a park ranger, I am a father, I am a husband, blah blah. This whole lamenting thing, and it actually clicked through it. And he has a story that NPR, of course, picked up. The guy he was in his 40s and he only worked there for 8 months. And so he's one of those probationary employees that are laid off. And so, as a cost cutting measure, because we're over $35 trillion in debt, the hiring spree that went on for the last year, at the end of Biden's term, Trump's administration is just terminating all the probationary employees because you don't need them. Yeah. I mean, you can't run these deficits forever. And so this would be a perfect person to lay off. He's probationary and is not protected by civil service. And they're just all getting wiped out. And that's sad for him and his family. And I feel bad for him. But, he's in his 40s. He got this job, 8 months ago. He can get another job and not on the government payroll. Yeah. And so we're going to see this where it's recycled, woe is us. And this is a terrible injustice. These people are losing their jobs. 60 Minutes had a story on Sunday that was talking about U.S. aid cuts. And they interviewed two people. One person was a political employee. Mm-hmm. So of course that person gets fired. Yeah. The other one was a contractor. So neither one of them were civil service. Yeah. And and of course, you don't need to have contract employees with USAID when you're running, again, a 35, maybe it's up to $37 trillion deficit. So or debt. total back debt. So a $2 trillion annual deficit. Of course, you're going to cancel the contracts, and it's good. It's a net positive for the United States. But the stories are going to be, you're going to see this. You're going to be recycled every time anybody wants to cut a government program. Every time anybody wants to cut a government benefit, the media recycles these scare stories. Oh my gosh, look at this injustice. What are these poor people going to do? I don't know. Get a job. I mean, was this some great mystery in November when the election happened? In November, for crying out loud. This guy really thought he's going to have a job for life when the campaign was partly, we're going to fire all these people. I mean, it was no mystery. Everybody in the federal workforce at this point, certainly at this point, knows they're on borrowed time. Yeah, they better get valuable for their salary, or they're going to get fired. And the whole agencies and whole departments are going to get laid off. And it's just necessary because we got too out of control in spending. So Sol's message here, I think, is just timeless, because people, like Generation X, we're old enough to remember when we were little kids and they were trying to scare us saying the world's going to freeze. The ice age is coming. And then it's global warming. So it's like, one of my favorite shows to watch when I was a kid was Nature on PBS. But it became such a drag because you'd learn for like 45 minutes about these wonderful creatures. And the last 15 minutes they're all going to die. The whole world's going to collapse. It's like, I just kind of want to learn about the hammerhead shark. I think it's a fascinating, or the Komodo dragon. It's fascinating. But it's all going to die. Well, guess what? I'm now 54, and the Komodo dragons are still alive in Madagascar, I believe. Hammerhead sharks still around. Yes. But when I was 9, they're all going to die. Anyway, so he makes good points.
The next
he also mentions about, he makes an allusion. This must have been written before the subprime mortgage crisis of 07 or 08. I don't know if you noticed that. He talked about, people with bad credit have to pay more as part of the subprime mortgages. And so there was this huge, these articles he's referring to are in 2005, where there's this push saying there's racism because African Americans and other minorities are getting denied mortgages. So the government pressured banks to loan more money to what they called underprivileged. Well, they're really what they were bad risks because their credit history, they didn't pay their bills on time for whatever reason. And so that just exploded in the mid 2000s. And that's what created the subprime mortgage crisis, because there's so much defaults. And then there's a default swaps. And I know there's a whole financial thing about it. There's a whole bunch of people that got really rich on it that were criminals that should be in prison today, that got bailed out and didn't go to prison. But this pressure that he's talking about, these articles, to provide mortgages to people that shouldn't be given mortgages because they're a bad credit risk. They should have to rent, build up their credit score, and pay their bills on time, and build up a pattern of paying their debts, because nobody should be, no responsible bank is going to loan $200,000+ to somebody that never pays their bills on time. No matter what their income is, because the articles were, well, their income is the same, but the white person is getting accepted at a higher rate. Black people are getting accepted at a lower rate. But when you control it for credit scores, which really is the pattern of paying your debt, it equals. You'll have the same approval given the same scores. You just take race out of it, and it's even. Yeah. So that was his point. Anyway, sorry, I went on.
No, that's a good point to bring up. But I really enjoyed this next article too, called "Geography versus Equality." Yes. Just talking about the example of the Balkans, where he says, in the early 20th century, the average income in the Balkans was only about 1/4 of the average income in Western European nations. Much of this was a result of geography. So he's saying, you have all these claims of, well, why are these nations, poorer than these other ones? Well, it's because these other nations exploited them. He makes, the Balkans were just much less accessible, right? You have a mountain range that cuts everybody off, especially in the days of the early industrial revolution. So they couldn't get those new technology. It was harder to ship raw resources to them because there wasn't a good, system of waterways. You have to go all the way around by the Mediterranean. And that's just sort of impacted those countries', productivity since then. And he makes the other good point too, that, the British, he says, were able to cross the Atlantic in the first place only because of cultural advances that they had borrowed from other peoples in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East.
Yes.
They steered their ships with rudders invented in China. They navigated with instruments based on trigonometry, which was invented in Egypt. Calculations were done with numbers, invented in India. He says much of they knew about the world was acquired by reading material written in letters invented by the Romans. So he says it's not the case that these cultures are just like inherently exclusionary and they're just going to, block off people they don't like forever. No, they're going to take stuff that's useful, and because they have interconnections with these people, they can use those good technologies and better themselves and better the other countries because of it. And that's really the reason why you do have inequality between massive geographical regions, is because generally it's based on resources and access to technology and things like that.
Yeah, and one thing you mentioned, and it was a great summary of his main points, and he also mentioned how Western Europe had, or really throughout Europe, had an ability to share information with regard to agriculture in particular, because it was the same temperate climate. But in Europe, it goes across like the same, was that latitude or longitude, whatever it is.
Latitude.
Then like in North America to South America, you go through a warmer climate to closer to the equator, but up in northern Canada, you're not going to be able to grow the same crops as you would. He talks about the traveling from north to south as opposed to east to west, which I never really heard that argument before, so that was kind of interesting. As a local matter, it kind of struck me like there's two counties in our area, not your area anymore because you're down in Florida right now, but like St. Charles County where I grew up, it's really flat. It's between the Mississippi River and the Missouri River, and I guess because the flow of water and sand and all that kind of stuff, it's flat farmland. So, and it's a suburb of St. Louis. Jefferson County is to the south, and it's hilly and rocky. Mm-hmm. So the development of St. Charles County was much faster, and they're much more populous now, and much more affluent than Jefferson County. Mainly because if you build anything in Jefferson County, it is a running joke, like some developers say, "Oh, we unexpectedly hit rock," and that's a joke because you always hit rock in Jefferson County, and that inhibits large scale development because you have to basically quarry out a foundation for a house. Mm-hmm. Where in St. Charles, it was just perfect to develop large scale subdivisions, and they're basically equal distance to commute to work. But the geography, which is his point,
even before that, even more historically speaking, the flatter land, the richer soil in between the rivers, yes, had better agriculture, and so you even go farther back than that. And I think that's his sort of through line throughout a lot of these articles, is just looking at things in a better historical context, which I think I've mentioned in the podcast before, but that's my problem with a lot of linguistic stuff, is that history for a lot of linguists starts maybe in the 1700s, most often the 1800s, both like in terms of like what is language and looking at sort of philosophical ideas, like they'll never go before the early 1800s really, but also just in like looking at contact between people, right? You hear all the time about, language endangerment is the result of colonialism and stuff like that. It's like linguists are really good at looking at the history of words, going back, where does this word come from? But then looking at like the history of people, they only go back a couple hundred years. So you hear that a lot. And that came up with one of the articles that I was reading for class on the Berber languages. The article was arguing that really there's only a concerted effort to sort of remove the Berber languages from North Africa following French colonialism, because that created like a state ideology, and then these states, it's really Arabic that's pushing out all the Berber languages. It's an Arab-controlled, countries, and they want, to make it really Arab singularly throughout all of these countries. And so the author was trying to argue, well, this state ideology prompted these nations to do this and this and this, kind of ignoring the fact that there was an Arab conquest, or if not conquest, at least mass migration throughout all of North Africa, starting in the 7th century, that brought Arabic and pushed the Berber people out originally. And even before that, the Berber languages are one of the very first languages where we have recorded mention of like a planned death of a language. There's writing from 1000 BC from the Egyptian, one of the Egyptian pharaohs, talking about how he wanted to cast out the people, referring to tribes that we now know as the Berber people, and make them speak Egyptian. So it's like going back 3,000 years, this has been going on. But you don't find any mention of that. It's because the French imposed this sort of state ideology because there wasn't a nation state before that. And then the Arab people used that and wanted to have, this only Arabic spoken sort of ideology. And it's because of this colonialism. Well, not really. If you go back long enough, and you have this argument too. It's you see, well, languages are dying at a much faster rate than they ever have before. And some of that's true a little bit. I think it's massively overblown. I think, with the spread of globalization, that makes, smaller languages die out a little bit quicker. But the very fact that we've, over the past few decades, documented more languages.
Yes.
So we've gotten much more specific with what is a language, how do these differentiate? And so we have just more languages total. And so when a language, which may have formerly just been thought of, that was a dialect of this bigger language, dies, right? 100 years ago, you wouldn't have noted that as a dead language, right? You just thought, okay, well, it's just how these people speak in this community of this bigger language. So the language didn't die. It was just sort of that manner that they spoke it in. So you don't have statistics on that sort of thing. But also going back further, with Latin, we know Latin pushed out a bunch of languages in the Roman Empire throughout Europe and in North Africa too, and in Asia Minor. And of course, we don't have any record of that stuff. And so it's like saying that this is a truly unique thing happening over these past couple decades. It's just we don't know how many languages were lost, really before 100 years ago, because we just don't have good record of these things. Yeah. And so it's this thing, you don't have a good historical context for a lot of it. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, what do you think? That's the interesting point. I didn't know. I mean, of course, I would know, but I didn't know anything about like the Egyptians trying to what do they call that? Like a genocide or whatever. Trying to eliminate a culture. That many years ago. It really speaks to the strength of the Berber people to be able to withstand.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends on the time frame too, because you have this one pharaoh who's like, okay, we need to kick out all these tribes, but then you also have a lot of Arab Berber intermingling. I wrote a paper on this. That was my capstone for my classics degree. Was the sort of relation between the Berber god Amun and how he was syncretized with the Egyptian gods and also with the Greeks and the Romans, because that's where Alexander the Great, he visited an oracle of Amun, and you have Amun Ra and things like that. So it's this mingling of culture where at one point in history we want to eliminate sort of these Berber people. Another point in history we're bringing them in, sort of incorporating all our beliefs. But it's like you just don't have that sort of historical context with a lot of linguistic stuff.
Yeah. What do you think? This is a little off topic, but what do you think about the effect of AI and really these really supercomputes to be able to document, number one, to document the language is so much more effectively and interpret them because of the compute power. And then secondly, it seems like we're going to be very, very soon we'll have like a Star Trek version of the Universal Translator.
Yeah.
We'll just be able to press a button and we'll be able to just, communicate to each other through earbuds, and I'll be talking in English, but you can even hear an AI version of my voice in French. What do you think of that? How it will affect your field and development of language going forward? Yeah,
I'll say two things, I guess. Practically speaking, it's changed linguistics a lot because you have a lot of new jobs in computational linguistics, because a lot of these AI companies are hiring linguists because they're like, we need to train these things how to speak like a human. We need to figure out how language works. So there's a lot of computational linguistics jobs open. So over the next 5 years, 10 years, maybe, you'll have sort of an increase in those. And you've seen a lot of linguistics departments be like, oh, we need more computational linguists because that's where the jobs are. I think that bubble's going to pop in like 10 years. So that's sort of the practical side. But in how AI actually functions, I don't think it will help too much in language documentation, because the way AI works is it's really just predicting what is most likely to come next. Is how these AI models work. And so they have to be trained on massive amounts of data to be able to accurately talk, within that language, right? They're really only successful if you have this gigantic corpus, because they're not like humans at all. Because humans learn language on a very, very small, relatively speaking, set of data. And we just have these rules already within our minds, the universal grammar idea, that enable us to learn language very quickly. AI doesn't have that. AI is sort of just a behaviorist. It just copies what it knows and sort of derives patterns from that. So if you have a language that doesn't have a lot of data, doesn't have a lot of written sources, you might be able to get AI to sort of, figure out a problem in a language that you're working on. But if you just try to feed, the small amount of data we have with undocumented languages to AI, they're going to overgeneralize, and they're going to create constructions that aren't allowed in a language. And it's just going to be a mess, and it's just not actually going to reflect how the language works, if that makes sense.
I feel like this is like a foreshadowing scene of ultimately your usefulness in overthrowing the AI overlords in a dystopian future. You'll be able to crack their code.
Sure.
And gum up the works, and then the whole thing will just crash in upon itself because it won't understand what what it's doing. You'll make it go insane. So bookmark that.
Yeah.
Remember it so that when the robots come,
yeah,
you can fight back.
I've tried.
You're the modern John Connor.
Yeah. But I mean, I've tried sort of the endangered languages thing with AI, where I've asked it to like generate me phrases in a sentence or in a language that if I have the data in front of me, very small documented language, and if you try and have it just say, here, write this sentence in X language, usually you'll get it wrong if it's not a language that has millions and millions or billions of words available on the internet.
Fascinating. Yeah. It's really interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, we move on to the next one here.
Yeah, assumptions behind affirmative action, and I think this is pretty much a very similar argument, if I remember correctly.
What we had last week, yeah.
So caught up in my AI discussion. He just talks about how that there are assumptions that some people cannot do certain things, but then there's also, he talks about like cultural differences, like certain communities are predominantly like in a certain field, like I think this is the one they're talking about, like that ship makers in a certain community in Europe and are of such an ancestry, and he like mentions in southern Brazil, whole industries were owned by people of German ancestry, and such crops as tomatoes and tea have been grown predominantly by people of Japanese ancestry. And he's making the point that sometimes like a community just gets known for proficiency in a certain area, and they develop an expertise in it that they share through the generations, and that's good and that's okay. And so you're going to have different aptitudes, and a disparity in income, or a disparity in the ability to be a disparity in the numbers in any particular field. Mm-hmm. If those cultural influences are present. So, he's just making the points, that these different communities, like he mentions, that they can overcome, certain disadvantages over time, if left to their own devices, and if they have a culture of learning from and understanding that they need to do things better or do things differently. He mentions what saved the Japanese was that they recognized their own backwardness. This is pre-industrialized Japan, and worked for generations to overcome it. Now, of course, they became a powerhouse, quite literally. But he always has some words of wisdom towards the end of his articles, and I like this quote: "Unfortunately, a whole industry of civil rights activists, politicians, and miscellaneous hustlers has every vested interest in promoting victimhood, resentment, and paranoia instead." And there he's talking about, like if there's no incentive to improve, you're never going to improve. Mm-hmm. And so if your leaders in a community are saying, well, it's not your fault, you don't need to do anything different, then there's no reason to do anything differently. You have to correct, it's everybody else's mistake. And like the example of the Japanese, they didn't have anybody that was in their culture saying, oh, it's their fault. Instead their culture was, hey, we have to do this better to compete.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important message.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have too much to add. That was a good summary. I do like this line on 272. It's very similar to the one you read. He says, "Those who make careers out of attributing disparities to the wickedness of other people are an obstacle to the development of more human capital among the poor." So it's like if you just kind of blame other causes, you're really distracting from what the root problem might be, and you're distracting from doing anything that will actually help these people, and you're just sort of making up issues as you go along.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that kind of goes into the next article, which is a little more assertive on this point, which is titled "The Multiculturalism Cult." And he says let's see, where is he? He's talking about the spread of technology and skills. He says the reason why these things spread was quite simply that some things were considered better than others, and people wanted the best they could get. This is completely the contrary to the philosophy of the quote multiculturalism cult, where things are not better or worse, just different. Yeah. And that relativity that we've talked about on this podcast in many different contexts, he's really hit the nail on the head. Where you're by not making value judgments, you devalue everything. And you don't improve anything because it's all the same. Well, their culture is the same as ours. Well, it's not the same. There's who was I talking to that had never heard the allegation that it was a white thing to be on time, because you even hear that sometimes where what Sol will call race hustlers saying, well, you shouldn't discipline black employees because
or dress codes. I've heard that same thing. Yeah.
For showing up a few minutes late because it's part of their culture. It's like, what? I mean, it's infantizing them. It's like they're children. They can't figure out how to get up earlier and get their butt to work on time. I mean, that's insane, and it's so insulting. But if you value that so-called culture of not showing up on time when you're scheduled to be there, then there's no reason to change it because who am I to say that the culture of showing up when you're supposed to show up and work until the day is over, the shift is over, is if that's just as valuable as getting the job done when you get it done on your own schedule, then who's to say that it should be done my way as opposed to their way?
Yeah. Yeah, I like what he says, bottom of 272. He says, when Europeans first discovered paper and printing from China, they did not, quote, celebrate diversity. They stopped giving themselves writer's cramp from copying scrolls and started letting the printing presses do the work. Right. I think that's very true because it's you see this now where it's just anything that's different is sort of praised just by merit of it being different. Right. It's got kind of what you were saying. It's like we don't really attribute value to anything. And it's like, well, clearly, and he points this out, throughout this whole article, and we kind of talked about it earlier. It's like with borrowing technology and elements of culture from other nations can be very, very helpful. And we've done that throughout all of human history because we just take things that are better, that will improve our lives. And so it's like, but you were never doing it just because let's do something different and let's just make things a bit, more colorful, I guess, is sort of the mindset of a lot of people. It's like, well, if you don't meet the certain quota of this amount of elements in your work and stuff like that, it's not good. But we borrowed things and we sort of share elements of our culture because there's good things in a lot of different cultures and we can learn from them. But it's not just because they're different from us. We have to put value on things.
And I like his use of the example of the Native Americans who didn't have horses until the European explorers came over and some of them got loose. And then over the decades and centuries, they developed the Native American tribes. Several of them created a really impressive horse culture, like where they were hunting and fighting. And became great horsemen over time. And you got to remember that when somebody says Europeans didn't do anything good for the Indians.
That's another point because it's you see all the time. It's sort of the depiction of the Native Americans is like, well, this is their traditional way of life. Well, I mean, 400 years ago is like the earliest they would have had that, or 600, I guess, if you go all the way back to late 1400s. But that was another point. I don't mean to keep going back to this one linguistics article. But that was another point that really bothered me was that, there's a dialect of Arabic spoken in North Africa, North African Arabic, also called Darija, among the local people. It's kind of different. It didn't just branch off of like classical Arabic at one point in time. There's sort of theories that, maybe has a basis in Phoenician or has like a Berber basis, but then adopted enough Arabic loanwords, when the migration came through, that it became sort of a dialect of Arabic in that way. And the author asserts in this article that it's a native language at the same level that Berber is. But that's just impossible, right? Because it's even if it isn't, just a direct branch off of classical Arabic, for it to have developed in the way that it did and for it to be the language that it is entirely dependent on Arabic and from foreign influence. So it's like it had to have come from somewhere, right? And of course, Berber didn't just spring up out of the ground, when the world was created in North Africa. Every language comes from somewhere else. True, right. But it cannot be at the same level as Berber in that regard, because it had to have been borrowed from somewhere or had enough foreign influence. And it was just so weird that he includes that as that's a native language at the same way that the Berber languages are. Very strange.
Yeah, it has to be a generation after it, at least.
Oh, yeah. Many generations, because not until the late 600s, and the Berber people.
What I mean is like as languages, yes. Not like human generation, but a language generation. It has to at least be a generation after Berber, because it's a derivation of Berber and Arabic, right?
Yeah. It's just so strange to me reading. It's like, that's very, very weird. Yes. Yeah, little things like that you see all the time in linguistics articles.
They could use some logic classes. You should have had that as an introductory course. Required course. Yeah. Well, then are we going to the next one too, or not?
Yeah. Life is culturally biased. We'll have two more. This one and then the book.
Oh my gosh, let's go fast.
But yeah, I know we've mentioned this before, the bell curve by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. This is before.
Be careful.
Let's say, if you want to talk about this one, go ahead.
Yeah. If you're going to be in academia, you don't want to talk about the bell curve. And he mentions, does he do the bell curve twice in both articles, or no? It's just this one. Okay, so I think he mentioned it before in this book. It gets really controversial because most of the book is about that IQ has a genetic component, and so most of their book was just talking about that and how it's there's some inherited component to IQ or intelligence, but the IQ was pretty determinative as to the person's success in life. The higher the IQ, the more success they're going to have, and it makes a certain amount of sense. And I think he doesn't really talk about this, but it's a funny subject because people equate intelligence with morality, moral goodness. So like, for instance, like when your kids are really smart, like all four of our boys are really, really super geniuses. But to say that, people get offended. Like other parents are offended that my kids are smarter than them. However, if their kids are like super athletes and they're just creaming my kids, I mean, literally embarrassing them in public, on a soccer field or a basketball court or whatever. I cheer for them.
That's never happened. Very hypothetical.
Well, not with you, with your brothers. Yeah. It's like, and you're all, have your own athletic endeavors. Yeah, I'm not saying that you're slubs, but you should expect to be complimented if you're an excellent athlete. That's an obvious example, but so a lot of this is tied up in that intelligence and morality. Mm-hmm. And so if anybody goes into this study of, okay, what's the effect of intelligence on monetary or professional success, you're going to find a correlation. But what does that mean? And then what to do with that? So IQ tests have been attacked for probably my entire lifetime. I mean, certainly my entire adult life, because they're saying they're discriminatory against certain groups of people, which I think is really weird. Mm-hmm. Because part of the issue is, okay, how do you help the high achieving students in an underprivileged, like a poor neighborhood? And you have to be able to identify them, and really you have to pull them out of the mediocre classes and the remedial classes, you'd say, because they're just killing time and they're being dragged down. But a lot of the left wing views with regard to intelligence and race believe that separating out the really smart kids is somehow a bad thing, but it's a necessary thing. It's like having the really fat, slow kids have a basketball team, and they're playing basketball against the most athletic people in the school. You would not do that. It's just mean. It's mean to the really athletic kids because it's boring. Like it's boring to have a 50-0 basketball game. And it's boring to be a smart kid in the remedial English class. And anyway, that's my own little rant on it. But he says, even just because students may have a lower IQ doesn't mean they can't be taught, they can't learn, they can't do much better than what they are. And in his last paragraph, I thought was really good. He says, my own view as a former teacher is that most American students of whatever background are operating so far below their capacity that the limits of that capacity is an academic question, meaning like there's no real practical value about what the search for their capacity is, because everybody's operating so lower than their capacity, their actual capacity. It's just a theoretical argument because everybody could do this work, or could certainly do better than what they're doing.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, man. I mean, I like his point about, the cultural bias there, because he says, the argument against him is, well, these IQ tests, they're just so biased towards, Western, white culture and stuff like that. And his argument is, well, yeah, because the tests are designed to measure people within this Western culture, because we're testing people, who might go on to be doctors or scientists of some sort. And so we're kind of testing based on that regard. And it's like, yeah, if we chose different metrics based on a different culture, that would give us different results, maybe. It's the average person, if they were pulled out of America and sort of dumped on in a sub-Saharan African tribe, they probably wouldn't fit in either. That's kind of his point. It's, things are sort of relative in that way, and that some, cultures are more scientifically advanced. And it's like, somebody from, a tribe that's just sort of been uncontacted for a long time might have the same amount of brain cells and the same amount of, brain activity as someone who's a leading scientist in Europe. But, we don't know. We don't know what would have happened if they were in a different culture. And he says, I like this quote in the bottom of 275. He says, what would have happened under other cultural circumstances is a cosmic question, a question for God, perhaps, but not for intellectuals who act as if they are God. Yeah. Right. It's like, you can't just, what if this same person, was born in a completely different area of the world? I don't know. We don't know what would happen because it's not how it ended up. We can't answer that question. It's just a massive what if, and it's just going to be a what if forever.
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, then
want to go to the next one.
Yeah. The last one for this chapter, comparing Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Really, I think,
Du Bois.
I don't know. Du Bois. I'll go with Du Bois. But the sort of the theme is they took very different approaches, at least publicly, towards race relations, sort of in the post-Reconstruction period in the early 1900s, where it was Booker T. Washington's sort of message was sort of the title of his book, Up from Slavery. He was really focused on establishing schools, trades, sort of helping black people who may have been part of the slave population, or certainly children of a slave population, sort of integrate back into society and just learn these life skills that they might not have been taught. Give them educational opportunities and stuff like that. The Tuskegee Institute was his whole project, and for that exact purpose. But Du Bois, he says, I think this quote really kind of describes the whole chapter. This is on the middle of 280. He says, the net result was that Washington was often praising whites of goodwill, while Du Bois was attacking whites of ill will. So Du Bois, he says, promoted academic education designed to produce militant fighters for the rights against oppressors, while, again, sort of Washington was doing something different, where it's more sort of the building up rather than attacking people who have been discriminatory towards the black population. So it's sort of the two ends of the spectrum here. It's whether do you build up this population, or you sort of bring down the population that was discriminatory towards the black population.
Yes. I don't know much about either of these.
Neither do I. Really. Yeah.
I haven't read about them, but I from this introduction, and I read a little bit summaries. I haven't read biographies or really in detail. And I get from Sowell, of course, Sowell is a practical person,
Mm-hmm.
And so he's this seems to be a defense of Booker T. Washington,
Yeah.
especially with regard to his private and secret advocacy for the same issues that W.B. Du Bois advocated for so publicly. And I don't think he comes out and says it, but he's kind of implying that, well, talk is cheap, and it's great to be a strident advocate for a cause when you're in friendly territory up north, than doing the grunt work like Booker Washington was doing
Mm-hmm.
in his institute. And I like this quote. He says, it's on 283. He says, Washington neither grinned nor shuffled for white folks, and he was hated by racist bigots in the South. When he had dinner in the White House with President Theodore Roosevelt, there were cries of outrage from across the South, and echoes reverberated for years afterward. So he was still at the forefront, of advocacy and equality, and was doing wonderful work. And I think, in some quarters that he's not celebrated anymore, because he wasn't as publicly strident or as pure, and you see that in other groups, like, you see that in conservative circles, they say, well, you're not, or you'll see it, now with, like, now that MAGA is, ascendant, well, you're not MAGA enough, and that kind of stuff. And there may be some truth to that with some people, but the real question is, okay, what's more important, being so vocal and strident, or actually getting stuff done? And I think his, Soul's argument in part is, when Booker T. Washington, got a lot of stuff done, and he focused on that, and therefore it wasn't productive for him to be out there insulting whites. I mean, he's basically already antagonizing them with his mere existence, and success, white racists, so it was I really enjoyed reading about it. It makes me want to add a biography of Booker T. Washington to my ever expanding list of topics to read about.
Yeah, I've heard Up From Slavery is really good. I've never read it, but that's his book. But yeah, the one last quote, and then I think we could probably end the episode. But he mentions, he's publicly, he wasn't talking about the questions of political issues and stuff, but he says, he's privately supported efforts to safeguard civil rights. Also wrote, anonymous newspaper articles, got, people federally appointed in Washington, things like that. But he says, this is at the sort of the bottom of 282. He says, what was utterly lacking in Booker T. Washington, however, was the ringing rhetoric of protest, so much beloved of intellectuals, however futile it might be in practice at the time. Washington practiced what militants of a later era would only preach, to advance the interests of blacks by all means necessary. That's that idea. It's like, well, if you're not saying the right things, clearly you're not doing enough. And it's like, well, I mean, I'm doing all of this stuff, some of it you just don't see. It's just not public stuff, but I'm doing it in private. But so much of his work was public, but they would rather hear, a lot of people think still today, for sure, would rather hear sort of a long-winded speech and sort of inflammatory messages and stuff like that, more along the lines of what Du Bois was saying. But Soul's message here is pretty clearly, get stuff done. You don't necessarily have to brag about it and inflame people to do it. Just do the right thing.
Now, I would say, I don't mean to say that Soul's critical of Du Bois. He at the very end, last 286, he said, the needless dissipation of energies and internal strife between the followers of Du Bois and followers of Washington was an extravagant luxury in an era when blacks could easily have used 10 more of each.
Yeah,
that's a great way to look at it. And you need people that will be more strident to push the envelope and publicly and take the slings and arrows. You also need the people that are just going to quietly go about doing the work too. So I think so. He's not saying that, he's not in any way denigrating either of them.
Yeah.
I think he's doing a comparative analysis and saying they're both great men and both contributed value to America. So I'm interested in reading about both.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Do you have any other final thoughts on this chapter?
No, I don't think so.
All right.
Excellent. I mean, his writing is so great and entertaining and precise. It's just such an easy read.
Yeah.
And it's really cerebral, but he doesn't talk down to you. but he makes it so easy to understand really complex issues, I think. And he should be required reading in high school and college. I mean, it's something from Tom. Nobody should graduate with a college degree without reading some of his stuff. I mean, it's just really, really talented writing.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been season 10, episode 12 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.